Hello everybody, this is Poppy's Book Club. We're reading The Story of Yvette and we're on to chapter 6. At the end of the last chapter, chapter 5, I asked you some questions. So the first question was, what was Mr. Alderson doing when James arrived? He was reading his newspaper. Second question was, what were some of the delicious things they had for tea? Do you remember the tea table was smothered with beautiful things for tea? There was a great long list of yummy things to eat. And so some of them were ham and egg pie, scones, salad, custard tarts, sausage rolls, and a great big trifle. So well done if you remembered any of those. And then the last one, what was the name of the cowman who came with news about the sick cow? Do you remember in the middle of tea, all having a nice tea, and then suddenly somebody came and said one of the cows was ill. And the cowman was called Stan. Okay, so well done if you got that right. Okay, so on to chapter 6. Okay. Monday morning disease, they used to call it. The almost unbelievably gross thickening of the hind limb in cart horses, which had stood in the stable over the weekend. It seemed that the sudden suspension of their normal work and exercise produced a massive swelling which gave many a farmer a nasty jolt right at the beginning of the week. But it was Wednesday evening now, and Mr. Crump's big shire gelding was greatly improved. That leg's less than half the size it was, I said, running my hand over the inside of the hook, feeling the remains of the swelling pitting under my fingers. I can see you've put in some hard work here. Aye, I did as you said. Mr. Crump's reply was typically quiet, but I knew he must have spent hours massaging the limb and forcibly exercising the horse, as I had told him when I gave him the injection on Monday. I began to fill the syringe for a repeat injection. He's having no corn, is he? Nay, nowt but bran. That's fine. I think he'll be back to normal in a day or two if you keep up the treatments. The farmer grunted, and no sign of approval showed in the big purple-red face, with its perpetually surprised expression. But I knew he was pleased all right. He was fond of the horse and had been unable to hide his concern at the animal's pain and distress on my first visit. I went into the house to wash my hands, and Mr. Crump led the way into the kitchen, his big frame lumbering clumsily ahead of me. He gave me soap and towel in his slow-moving way and stood back in silence as I leaned over the long, shallow sink of brown earthenware. As I dried my hands, he cleared his throat and spoke hesitantly. Would you like a drink of my wine? Before I could answer, Mrs. Crump came bustling through from an inner room. She was pulling on her hat, and behind her, her teenage son and daughter followed, dressed ready to go out. Oh, Albert, stop it, she snapped, looking up at her husband. Mr. Elliot doesn't want your wine. Wish you wouldn't pester people so with it. The boy grinned. Dad and his wine. He's always looking for a victim. His sister joined in the general laughter, and I had an uncomfortable feeling that Mr. Crump was the odd man out in his own home. We're going down to the village institute to see a school play, Mr. Elliot, the wife said briskly. We're late now, so we must be off. She hurried away with her children, leaving the big man looking after her sheepishly. There was a silence while I finished drying my hands. Then I turned to the farmer. Well, how about that drink, Mr. Crump? He hesitated for a moment, and the surprised look deepened. Would you really like to try some? I'd love to. Haven't had my evening meal yet. I could do with an aperitif. Right. I'll be back in a minute. He disappeared into the large pantry at the end of the kitchen and came back with a bottle of amber liquid and glasses. This is my rhubarb, he said, tipping out 2 good measures. I took a sip and then a good swallow and gasped as the liquid blazed a fiery trail down to my stomach. Oh, it's strong stuff, I said a little breathlessly, but the taste is very pleasant indeed. Mr. Crump watched approvingly as I took another drink. Aye, it's just right. Nearly 2 years old. I drained the glass, and this time the wine didn't burn so much on its way down, but seemed to wash around the walls of my empty stomach and send glowing tendrils creeping along my limbs. Delicious, I said. Absolutely delicious. Farmer looked pleased. He refilled the glasses and watched with rapt attention as I drank. When we'd finished the second glass, he jumped to his feet. Now, for a change, I want you to try somewhat different. He almost trotted to the pantry and produced another bottle, this time of colourless fluid. Elderflower, he said, panting slightly. When I tasted it, I was amazed at the delicate flavour, the bubbles sparkling and dancing on my tongue. Gosh, this is terrific. It's just like champagne, you know. You really have a gift. I'd never thought homemade wines could taste like this. Mr. Crump stared at me for a moment. Then one corner of his mouth began to twitch, and incredibly a shy smile spread slowly over his face. You're about the first I've ever heard say that. You'd think I was trying to poison folk when I offer 'em the wine. They always shy off, but they can sup plenty of beer and whiskey. Well, they don't know what they're missing, Mr. Crump. I watched while the farmer replenished my glass. I wouldn't have believed you could make stuff as good as this at home. I sipped appreciatively at the elderflower. It still tasted like champagne. I hadn't got more than halfway down the glass before Mr. Crump was clattering and clinking inside the pantry again. He emerged with a bottle with contents as deep as a deep blood red. Try that, he gasped. I was beginning to feel like a professional taster and rolled the first mouthful around my mouth with eyes half closed. Yes, just like an excellent port. But there's something else there, a fruitiness in the background. Something familiar about it. It's blackberry, shouted Mr. Crump triumphantly. One up to best I've done. Made it in 2 back ends since. It were a right good year for it. Leaning back in the chair, I took another drink of the rich, dark wine. It was round, flavoured, warming, and behind it there was always the elusive hint of the brambles. I could almost see the heavy hanging clusters of berries glistening black and succulent in the autumn sunshine. The mellowness of the image matched my mood, which was becoming more expansive by the minute, and I looked round with leisurely appreciation at the rough comfort of the farmhouse kitchen, at the hams and sides of bacon hanging from their hooks in the ceiling, and at my host sitting across the table, watching me eagerly. He was, I noticed for the first time, still wearing his cap. You know, I said, holding the glass high and studying its ruby depths against the light, I can't make up my mind which of your wines I like best. They're all excellent, and yet so different. Mr. Crump, too, had relaxed. He threw back his head and laughed delightedly before hurriedly refilling both of our tumblers. Oh, but you haven't started yet. I've got dozens of bottles in there, all different. You must try a few more. He shambled again over to the pantry, and this time when he reappeared he was weighed down by an armful of bottles of differing shapes and colours. What a charming man he was, I thought. How wrong I'd been in my previous assessment of him. It had been so easy to put him down as lumpish and unemotional, but as I looked at him now, his face was alight with friendship, hospitality, understanding. He cast off his inhibitions, and as he sat down, surrounded by the latest batch, he began to talk rapidly and fluently about wines and winemaking. He pulled me another. How did you find that un? Very nice. Bit sweet, maybe? Well, perhaps. Right. So I try some of this with it. The meticulous addition of a few drops of nameless liquid from the packed rows of bottles. How's that? Oh, marvellous. Now this one. Perhaps a bit sharpish, eh? Possibly, yes. Again, the tender trickling of a few mysterious droplets into my drink, and again the anxious inquiry, is that better? Just right. The big man drank with me, glass by glass. We tried parsnip and dandelion, cowslip and parsley, clover, gooseberry, beetroot and crabapple. Incredibly, we had some stuff made from turnips, which was so exquisite that I insisted on a refill. Everything gradually slowed down as we sat there. Time slowed down till it was finally meaningless. Mr. Crump and I slowed down, and our speech and actions became more and more deliberate. The farmer's visits to the pantry developed into laboured, unsteady affairs. Sometimes he took a roundabout route to reach the door, and on one occasion there was a tremendous crash from within, and I feared he had fallen among his bottles. But I couldn't be bothered to get up and see, and in due course he reappeared, apparently unharmed. It was around 9 o'clock that I heard the soft knocking on the outer door. I ignored it, as I didn't want to interrupt Mr. Crump, who was in the middle of a deep explanation. "This," he was saying, leaning close to me and tapping a bulbous flagon with his forefinger, "this is, in my opinion, comparable to a fine Moselle, made it last year, and would appreciate it if you told me what you think." He bent low over the glass, blinking, heavy-eyed as he poured. "Now then, what do you say? Is it or isn't it?" I took a gulp and paused for a moment. It all tasted the same now, and I'd never drunk Moselle anyway, but I nodded and hiccuped solemnly in reply. The farmer rested a friendly hand on my shoulder and was about to make a further speech when he, too, heard the knocking. He made his way across the floor with some difficulty and opened the door. A young lad was standing there, and I heard a few muttered words. "We have a cow on calving, and we phoned surgery, and they said veterinary might still be here." Mr. Crump turned to face me. "It's the Bamfords of Hollybush. They want you to go there. Just a mile along the road." Right. I heaved myself to my feet, then gripped the table tightly as the familiar objects of the room began to whirl rapidly around me. When they came to rest, Mr. Crump appeared to be standing at the head of a fairly steep slope. The kitchen floor had seemed perfectly level when I'd come in, but now it was all I could do to fight my way up the gradient. When I reached the door, Mr. Crump was staring owlishly into the darkness. "Shraining," he said. "Shraining like hell." I peered out at the steady beat of the dark water on the cobbles of the yard, but my car was just a few yards away, and I was about to set out when the farmer caught my arm. "Just a minute. Can't go out like that." He held up a finger, then went over and groped about in a drawer. At length he produced a tweed cap, which he offered me with great dignity. I never wore anything on my head, whatever the weather, but I was deeply touched, and wrung my companion's hand in silence. It was understandable that a man like Mr. Crump, who wore his cap at all times, indoors and out, would recoil in horror from the idea of anybody venturing uncovered into the rain. The tweed cap which I now pulled on was the biggest I had ever seen. A great, round, flat pancake of a thing, which even at that moment I felt would keep not only my head but my shoulders and my entire body dry in the heaviest downpour. I took my leave of Mr. Crump with reluctance, and as I settled in the seat of the car, trying to remember where first gear was situated, I could see his bulky form silhouetted against the light from the kitchen. He was waving his hand with gentle benevolence, and it struck me as I at length drove away what a deep and wonderful friendship had been forged that night. In the yard at Hollybush I got out of the car, nodded to the shadowy group of figures standing there, fumbled my bottle of antiseptic and carving ropes from the boot, and marched determinedly into the byre. One of the men held an oil lamp over a cow lying on a deep bed of straw in one of the standings. A calf's foot protruded a few inches, and as the cow strained, a little muzzle showed momentarily, then disappeared as she relaxed. I turned and looked at the Bamfords for the first time. I hadn't met them before, but it was easy to classify them. Simple, kindly, anxious to please people. 2 middle-aged men, probably brothers, and 2 young men who would be the sons of one or the other. They were all staring at me in the dim light, their eyes expectant, their mouths slightly open as though ready to smile or laugh if given half a chance. I squared my shoulders, took a deep breath, and said in a loud voice, "Would you please bring me a bucket of hot water, some soap and a towel?" Or at least that's what I meant to say, because what actually came from my lips was a torrent of something that sounded like Swahili. The Bamfords, poised and ready to spring into action to do my bidding, looked at me blankly. I cleared my throat, swallowed, took a few seconds' rest, and tried again. Another volley of gibberish echoed uselessly round the cowhouse. Clearly I had a problem. It was essential to communicate in some way, particularly since these people didn't know me and were waiting for some action. I suppose I must have appeared a strange and enigmatic figure standing there, straight and solemn, surmounted and dominated by a vast cap. But through the mists a flash of insight showed me where I was going wrong. It was overconfidence. It wasn't a bit of good trying to speak loudly like that. I tried again in the faintest of whispers. "Could I please have a bucket of hot water, some soap and a towel?" It came out beautifully, though the oldest Mr. Bamford didn't quite get it the first time. He came close, cupped an ear with his hand, and watched my lips intently. Then he nodded, eagerly in comprehension, held up a forefinger at me, tiptoed across the floor like a tightrope walker to one of the sons, and whispered in his ear. The young man turned and crept out noiselessly, closing the door behind him with the utmost care. He was back in less than a minute, padding over the cobbles daintily in his heavy boots, and placed the bucket gingerly in front of me. I managed to remove my jacket, tie, and shirt quite efficiently, and they were taken from me in silence and hung upon nails by the Bamfords, who were moving around as though in church. I thought I was doing fine till I started to wash my arms. The soap kept shooting from my arms, slithering into the dung channel, disappearing into the dark corners of the byre, with the Bamfords in hot pursuit. It was worse still when I tried to work up to the top of my arms. The soap flew over my shoulders like a live thing, at times cannoning off the walls, at others gliding down my back. The farmers never knew where the next shot was going, and they took on the appearance of a really sharp field inside, crouching around me with arms outstretched, waiting for a catch. However, I did finally work up a lather and was ready to start, but the cow refused firmly to get to her feet, so I had to stretch out behind her, face down on the unyielding cobbles. It wasn't till I got down there that I felt the great cap dropping over my ears. I must have put it on again after removing my shirt, though it was difficult to see what purpose it might serve. The snag was that as I reached forward, the cow kept straining, squeezing my arm cruelly against her bony pelvis, making me groan and roll about in agony for a few seconds till the pressure went off. Quite often in these crises, my cap fell on the floor, and each time gentle hands replaced it immediately on my head. At last the foot was in my hand. There would be no need for ropes this time, and I began to pull it round. It took me longer than I thought, and it seemed to me that the calf was beginning to lose patience with me, because when its head was forced out by the cow's contractions, We were eye to eye, and I fancy the little creature was giving me a disgusted, "For heaven's sake, get on with it" look. When the leg did come round, it was with a rush, and in an instant everything was laid as it should have been. "Get hold of the feet," I whispered to the Bamfords, and after a hushed consultation they took up their places. In no time at all the fine heifer calf was wriggling on the cobbles, shaking its head and snorting the placental fluid from its nostrils. In response to my softly hissed instructions, the farmers rubbed the little creature down with straw wisps and pulled it round for its mother to lick. It was a happy ending to the most peaceful calving I've ever attended. Never a voice raised, everybody moving around on tiptoe. I got dressed in a cathedral silence, went out to the car, breathed a final good night, and left with the Bamfords waving mutely. To say I had a hangover next morning would be failing even to hint at the utter disintegration of my bodily economy and personality. Only somebody who had consumed 2 or 3 quarts of assorted homemade wines at a sitting could have an inkling of the quaking nausea, the raging inferno within, the jangling nerves, the black, despairing outlook. "What are you walking like that for, James?" asked Siegfried in what sounded like a bull's bellow, as I came in on him at breakfast. "You look as though you'd peed yourself." "Oh, it's nothing much." It was no good telling him. I was treading warily across the carpet, because I was convinced that if I let my heels down too suddenly it would jar my eyeballs from their sockets. I had a few glasses of Mr. Crump's wine last night, and it seems to have upset me." "A few glasses? You ought to be more careful. That stuff's dynamite. Could knock anybody over." He crashed his cup into its saucer, then began to clatter about with his knife and fork. "I hope you weren't any the worse to go to the Bamfords." I listlessly crumbled some dry toast on my plate. "Well, I did the job all right, but I had a bit too much. No use denying it." Siegfried was in one of his encouraging moods. "By God, James, those Bamfords are very strict Methodists. They're grand chaps, but absolutely dead nuts against the drink. If they thought you were under the influence of alcohol, they'd never have you on the place again." "Hope they didn't notice anything. Do you think they knew?" "Oh, maybe not. No, I shouldn't think so." I closed my eyes and shivered as Siegfried pushed a forkful of sausage and fried bread into his mouth and began to chew briskly. My mind went back to the gentle hands, replacing the monstrous cap on my head, and I groaned inwardly. Those Bamfords knew all right. Oh yes, they knew. That's a funny one. I love the bit when the soap's flying all over the place. Always makes me laugh. Anyway, to the questions. Right, so the first question: what was the name of the farmer who gave James all the homemade wine? Got him a bit drunk, didn't it? So what was that farmer's name? Next question: what kind of hat did Mr. Crump give to James as he left when he was going out in the rain? So what kind of hat? And finally, did the Bamfords know James was drunk? That's the question. Okay, hope you get on all right with those questions and hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.